From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. On the brief today, Kevin Cirilli from Las Vegas on that rumble last night out in the Democratic debate stage. From Hong Kong, we have Sophie Cameron on the continuing fallout from the coronavirus, and Bill Ferry's in Washington on President Trump's choice for a new head of national intelligence. So, Kevin, up still, no sleep as far as I can tell, but give us your take on what happened last night out in Las Vegas.
Precisely. It was a battle, to say the least. And here are my three big takeaways. First and foremost, Senator Bernie Sanders still very much holding on to that front-runner status. I spoke with three senior advisors to Sanders' campaign after the debate, and all of them felt that they are feeling emboldened heading into Saturday's Nevada caucus in just a few short days. And according to the polls, he still has that lead. Secondly, the Bloomberg campaign had tried to make this a two-person race between Bloomberg and Sanders. But the reaction last night from Senator Elizabeth Warren, former South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg, former Vice President Joe Biden, and Senator Amy Klobuchar, all of them suggesting they have no intentions of getting out of this race prior to Super Tuesday. And finally, David, on the issue of Super Tuesday, especially when it relates to delegates, the Sanders campaign is already laying the groundwork that even if they are not able to clinch the precise number of delegates that are needed for them to formally have the nomination, should he be able to get more delegates than the other candidates, it's going to be, according to them, very difficult to stop him.
Yeah, the founder and majority owner of our parent company, Bloomberg, was really in the center of the spotlight last night. No question about it. Take us into what happens next exactly. South Carolina is when? Is there another debate coming up? And then when is Super Tuesday? What do we look forward to?
In terms of the next 10 days, Saturday is the Nevada caucus. Then early next week, Tuesday, I believe, is the South Carolina Democratic presidential debate. And then next Saturday will be the South Carolina primary. Remember, the Biden campaign has suggested that South Carolina is a firewall of sorts for them to dig into. And then after that, Super Tuesday. With regards to Super Tuesday, it will be fascinating to see who is able to win California. Polls suggest Sanders is leading in that particular race, but also pay attention to Texas. And then there's a handful of contests after that in some battleground states. But again, based upon my reporting, I can tell you that I don't anticipate any significant candidates to drop out of this race between now and Super Tuesday, just because there's that sense of volatility that's baked in.
Yeah, no question about it. Thank you so much, Kevin, for the great reporting through the night and into the morning and now the day out in Las Vegas. Come on home, get some rest. And now we go to Sophie Cameron, who's over in Hong Kong reporting on the coronavirus. So, Sophie, one of the things that struck me this morning is it appears they've got a different methodology again in the numbers. I'm not sure I can keep track now of the numbers and what they're doing.
Yeah, once again, David, China changing up its methodology to count new infections, eliminating a category for clinically diagnosed cases by CT scans. So China reported fewer new confirmed cases, with Hubei adding only 349 after adding almost 1,700 the day before, adding then to questions about transparency of China's data. And the pickup of cases outside of China also raising red flags. South Korea marking its first coronavirus death, and Japan confirming 2 fatalities from a cruise ship that was quarantined off Yokohama, David.
And Sophie, we, of course, always want to say this is a human tragedy, first and foremost, but at the same time, it has business effects. And particularly, I suppose, in the airline industry. We're seeing it a lot in airlines going into and out of China.
Yeah, unsurprisingly, travelers remain nervous. And of course, there is the lockdown on Chinese citizens in some provinces. So falling passenger demand certainly weighing on airlines, which had IATA flagging the first annual decline in passenger demand since the SARS epidemic in 2003. And IATA expecting that global airlines revenue will take a hit of as much as $30 billion this year, with the strongest impact seen on China, as global carriers have cut flights to and from the mainland, and about 80% of China's domestic fleet remain grounded. So the government is seen moving to contain that fallout, with a potential takeover of H&A Group and more targeted relief measures seen for the aviation space, along with other industries.
Okay, Sophie, thanks again for your terrific reporting from Hong Kong. That's our colleague Sophie Cameron. And now we turn to Bill Ferry's in Washington. Bill, it turns out we have a new national head national intelligence.
Right. The President Trump is appointing his ambassador to Germany, a very outspoken Trump loyalist, Richard Grenell, to be his acting director of national intelligence. That position was filled by someone who was also in an acting position and because of U.S. law had to leave that post soon. So Grinnell is taking the job. We still don't know if he'll get it on a permanent position, but it puts someone who has been very outspoken and loyal to the president in a position overseeing the intelligence community that the president has long distrusted ever since the early days of his administration.
So staying in Washington, as I understand, there's a shakeup a bit at the National Security Council. And normally they'd say, oh, this is the normal course. Somebody's going over to the Energy Department. But there might be a little bit more to this one.
Right. We know that Victoria Coates, who's been the Deputy National Security Advisor, is getting moved over to the Department of Energy. The interesting thing is there's long been rumors around Coates that she may be anonymous, the person who wrote an op-ed column in the New York Times saying that there was a group of national security experts looking to tone down some of President Trump's national security policies. So that's long been denied by people close to Coates and her publisher. But it is kind of an interesting development during a week or the last couple of weeks in which we see President Trump pushing back against a lot of people who have been seen as critical of his administration or who took part in the impeachment trial.
And finally, Bill, let's go over to Turkey, because as I understand it, Turkey now is requesting for Patriot missiles to Washington, evidently in connection with that dispute on that northeast Syrian border up in Idlib province. Isn't there some irony there? I thought we had a fight with Turkey about those S-400s from Russia.
We are still having a fight with Turkey over its S-400 purchase from Russia, but Turkey asking, surprisingly, for a couple Patriot missile batteries to go on its southern border, where it has been pushing it back against Russian-supported Syrian forces. So there's some signs of increasing tensions between Ankara and Moscow here that has them turning back to their old NATO ally, the United States.
Okay, Bill, thank you so much for all that great reporting from Washington. It's our colleague, Bill Ferries, who covers national security there in Washington. And now it's time to get a check on how the markets are doing today and if they are reacting to today's top stories. Joining us, Abigail Doolittle. So I see the equity markets are down. I'm not sure I know why.
Yeah, there's a bit of a sell-off happening, and it's really come out of nowhere, seemingly nowhere. Earlier, stocks had basically been flat, but right around 11 a.m., a sharp nosedive lower. At this point, we have stocks on pace for the worst day in about 3 weeks. Now, some traders and sources are saying this has to do with renewed fears around the coronavirus. Apparently, there's one report that in Beijing, there's been a huge spike in infection. Plus, in Iran, one of the citizens who unfortunately died, apparently there's some saying that the government there covered up how it was spread within that country. So lots of unknown, lots of uncertainty. But it's what you and I have been talking about, that those bulls who've been pushing stocks higher have been assuming that this situation, this tragedy, as you said, this human tragedy, isn't going to get worse, and the impact in the global economic picture won't get worse. We just don't know that when we have these sorts of speculative and unfortunate reports out there.
As we said, it may not get that much worse, but it may. And the markets seem to be assuming it's not, and there's two sides to that trade. It depends on what happens.
And so those bulls are really getting caught off guard right now, because yesterday we had that FOMO feeling that it's not going to get any worse. Then you have some of these reports coming out, and folks are like, well, you know, actually we have Apple and a number of other companies that are actually having to adjust their outlook on this. Perhaps we need to pause a little bit. And another interesting aspect is the Japanese yen. It is down for a second day in a row. That wouldn't support this risk off, but some are saying that that's because of the fear that Japan itself could go into recession around the coronavirus. So lots of uncertainty.
Typically, you'd think you'd run into yen as a safe haven,
exactly.
But maybe not this time.
Yes, not this time, it seems.
Okay, Abigail, thank you so much for that report on the markets. And now it's time to turn to Mark Crumpton. He's here with Bloomberg First Word News.
David, global health officials are calling for nations around the world to boost funding to fight the coronavirus, while the outbreak is still mostly confined to China. The head of the World Health Organization says he's surprised that the response to his call for $675 million in funding has been limited. He says it's a sign that countries aren't treating the outbreak seriously enough. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is in Riyadh, where he met with Saudi Arabia's King Salman today. The two discussed their shared security concerns about Iran. Saudi Arabia and the United States blame Iran for an attack last summer against Saudi oil facilities that temporarily halved the kingdom's daily crude production. Iran denies involvement, and its allied Yemeni rebel Houthi group says it was behind the attack. German Chancellor Angela Merkel says her country must overcome what she calls the poison of racism. That after 11 people were killed in shootings Wednesday night near Frankfurt. Officials say it appeared to be a right-wing extremist attack by a lone gunman who was found dead hours later. A German newspaper published what it said was the government's 24-page manifesto in which he called for the, quote, complete destruction of about 20 nations, including India, Turkey, and Israel. Russian President Vladimir Putin says the ouster of the country's prime minister and a cabinet reshuffle that caught many in Russia off guard last month was not unexpected, but in an interview with the state-run TASS news agency, President Putin remained vague about the reasons for the move. The reshuffle came just hours after he announced a controversial constitutional reform during his annual State of the Nation address on January 15th. It was widely seen as a strategy for President Putin to stay in power well past the end of his term in 2024. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up, there was a prize fight in Las Vegas last night, but this time it wasn't in a boxing ring. It was on a debate stage. Our political contributor, Rick Davis, is here to score the debate for us. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
He has not managed his city very, very well when he was there. He didn't get a whole lot done. He had stop and frisk, throwing close to 5 million young black men up against the wall.
He has gotten some number of women, dozens, who knows, to sign non-disclosure agreements, both for sexual harassment and for gender discrimination in the workplace.
I don't care how much money anyone has. I think it's great you got a lot of money, but I think you've got to come forward with your tax return.
Those were some of the challenges to Mike Bloomberg. Michael Bloomberg, of course, is the founder and owner of this company. That happened last night in Las Vegas. The former New York mayor was the newcomer, and the other 5 candidates welcomed him from the start by making him the main target, leaving the presumptive frontrunner, Senator Bernie Sanders, relatively unscathed. Here to take us through what happened last night and to set out what comes next as we head towards Super Tuesday, our Bloomberg politics editor, Wendy Benjaminson, down in Washington, and Rick Davis is here with me in New York. He's a Bloomberg contributor and also, of course, former campaign manager for Senator John McCain. So, Wendy, I'll start with you. It's no big surprise that Michael Bloomberg was the target. Everybody thought he would be. They certainly delivered on that. But it was surprising to me that they spent so much time on Bloomberg.
Yes, they certainly were a pack of hyenas on Mike Bloomberg last night. There's no question about that. It was a little less surprising to me because the progressive wing of the party has coalesced all around Bernie Sanders, it seems, although Elizabeth Warren had a very strong night last night. The centrists are still fighting for relevance, fighting to be the alternative. Mike Bloomberg has unlimited money. He's advertising everywhere. He's focusing on the Super Tuesday states. And so the centrist Democrats, I believe, were trying to cut him off at the knees, weaken him, get him out of the way so that they can, show themselves as the alternative to Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, but that's the relevant point, Rick. Alternative to Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is clearly the front runner right now. Normally, I thought in these debates you went after the front runner. They didn't do that last night.
Well, there was a little bit of an approach to Bernie, and he got hot in the early session of the debate. And so it was an opportunity for people to pile on. But as you pointed out, and Wendy pointed out, Mike was the target for most people's criticism last night. And it's not so much how many people attacked Mike. The question was, how did Mike react to the attacks? And for a guy who's just entered his first debate, everyone else has had 8 practice sessions prior to this. Arguably, he was rusty, and he's going to have to up his game because that's not going to change. He has this wonderful thing. He's got the political safety net of hundreds of millions of dollars every single week pouring into these states on the air with the most positive message there can be. He has to deliver on that in the next debate so that there is not such a gap between his personal performance at a debate and what they're seeing in their homes.
And as you've pointed out to me, more people are watching Mike Bloomberg ads right now. They're watching that debate last night by a lot.
Oh, maybe 10 million people watched that debate last night, and 120 million people saw his commercials when they woke up this morning.
And we've had bad first debates from other candidates. Barack Obama did not start out strong in 2008, his first debate. George W. Bush didn't start out in 2000.
Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush.
So you can recover, but he's late in here. He has to recover pretty fast.
Well, he is. This is quite an experiment, right? No one's ever come into the process, a couple of weeks before the voting begins. And so he does need to catch up to where the rest of the field is, and he's got the personal capability to do it. I mean, in other words, he's a very bright guy with a track record in New York that has been very positive. He's run a huge company that's been wildly successful. So he's got things to talk about. He just needs to be able to step away from the attacks, pivot and counterpunch, and talk about his own agenda.
So when you talk about what comes next, okay, we have another caucuses on Saturday, and then what comes next? What's important for these candidates?
Well, they do have the caucuses on Saturday, and then the following Tuesday, 3 days later, there's another debate. And Mike Bloomberg and all the others have that much time to get ready for the next debate. That is followed by the South Carolina primary the following Saturday, February 29th. And then 3 days later is the all-important Super Tuesday. California, Texas, North Carolina, Minnesota, Virginia, and a bunch of other states and territories, a total of 14. This is the most significant night of the primary season. Somebody will come out of that, perhaps, with an insurmountable lead. We just don't know who it is. But Bernie Sanders has an awfully good head start right now.
Well, that's a great point. I mean, at what point, Rick, does Bernie Sanders' lead become insurmountable? Now, it's a lead, not necessarily a victory. You could go into the convention with more delegates than anybody else, but not enough.
Yeah, too early to tell what a convention is going to look like. Let's look at what's happening right now. People are already voting in almost every one of those states that Wendy was just pointing out. I mean, most of the Super Tuesday states have early voting. California specifically has been voting for a couple of weeks already. So the scenes that are playing out right now, the debates and the news cycles and the advertising, are already resulting in votes. In most of these places, Joe Biden still is competitive in the Super Tuesday states, according to the polling. Mike Bloomberg has shot up to the top of the heap, and Bernie Sanders, because of his early wins, has also increased his tempo in those states. So people are seeing that action right now. The biggest problem for someone like Joe Biden is he's resting his hopes on finishing first in South Carolina. But as Wendy points out, there's only 3 days between the voting of South Carolina and the voting of Super Tuesday. And so you really got to wonder how much of a bump could he get if it's that big of a 14-state cycle, and that people have probably already voted 20, 30, 40, 50% by the time South Carolina even occurs.
So Wendy, as we look at this, the question is who's going to stay in this race and for how long? Looking at that debate stage last night, it didn't look like any of them were inclined to leave right away. At the same time, money becomes increasingly important as we go into big TV market states. Do we know where the money is for these people?
Yeah, David, you're absolutely right, of course. I know that Bernie Sanders certainly is in this until the convention, as long as he keeps his momentum going. Mike Bloomberg has money to burn, literally, and can stay in as long as he wants, depending on how many delegates he can. He may at some point decide, to stop throwing good money after bad, but there's no end to it. Elizabeth Warren, and then you get to the Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg. It is all for them about whether they have enough money. Yeah. They are already campaigning. They're not, as we were in Iowa and New Hampshire, where they were parked there for months at a time. They are already jumping all over the map. They are in California, they're in Texas, they're in Colorado, they're in Virginia. They're all trying right now to campaign for Super Tuesday. Mm-hmm. But Klobuchar is just hiring staff in some of those Super Tuesday states now because she's raised enough money to get the momentum. So it's all about sort of, do I have the gas to keep going?
Quite a 10 days in front of us. Okay, thanks so much to Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson down in Washington and to Rick Davis, our special political contributor here in New York. Still ahead, E-Trade is our stock of the hour. The company is soaring after Morgan Stanley agrees to a $13 billion purchase. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Time now for our stocks of the hour. Not just stock, but stocks. E-Trade is the best performer on the S&P 500 today, surging more than 23% after Morgan Stanley agreed to buy the company for $13 billion. Morgan Stanley CEO James Gorman spoke to Bloomberg earlier, and he said that the deal really was a no-brainer.
We just put at risk 4.5 months of last year's earnings to buy an iconic institution with $600 billion of assets, $3 billion of revenues that's going to improve all of our financial models. This is a no-brainer from that perspective.
Bloomberg's Kaylee Lyons will joining us now to tell us more about Morgan Stanley and E-Trade. Well, if you listen to James, it sounds like it is a no-brainer.
Well, it's a no-brainer, maybe, but it was a very expensive one. At this deal, it's all stock, values E-Trade at about $58.74 a share. That's a 31% premium to where it closed yesterday, hence the big pop you're seeing for E-Trade. And Morgan Stanley actually moving to the downside today. You have a lot of analysts saying that this was a pretty lofty price tag. Actually, Mike Mayo over at Morgan Stanley at Wells Fargo, downgraded Morgan Stanley off the back of this today because it is a big deal, the largest bank deal that's been done since the financial crisis, and it creates a very large player, more than $3 trillion in assets under management. Of course, for E-Trade's part, it's been seen as a potential takeover target given how rapidly the retail brokerage space is changing. Not only the fee wars that have driven fees to zero and put pressure on revenue, but the fact that you're seeing consolidation elsewhere in the space, the likes of Charles Schwab and TD Ameritrade, which reached a $26 billion deal last year, combining to become a $5 trillion asset manager, and E-Trade has to compete with that.
It seems like scale is the name of the game, and there's never going to be too much scale because we just see merger after merger with huge asset values. But at the same time, you need to make some money, too. Does E-Trade have the margins that a Morgan Stanley is used to? Because if it doesn't, that can be dilutive, actually, of earnings.
Well, and that's a lot of the thing the street is flagging today in their more critical aspects of their view of this deal. For Morgan Stanley's part, though, this is really just doubling down on wealth management and specifically on retail investors, because Morgan Stanley's traditional clientele is that very wealthy investor. And as James Morgan, the CEO, put it on the call, this gives them access to emerging wealth, those millennial investors. And now with this deal, post E-Trade, Morgan Stanley would get about 57% of its revenue from those individual investors. So it's trying to diversify away from that, get access to digital direct-to-consumer banking.
Sort of entry-level private wealth clients, as a practical matter. At the same time, you mentioned there's consolidation in this industry with Charles Schwab and TD Ameritrade teaming up here. Might there be some review here that say we're getting too much concentration of these businesses?
It could get an extra eye given this has been a very hot space, but that regulation was actually something that came up on the analyst call this morning. James Gorman did not seem worried about it. He said they would not have pursued this deal if they didn't think regulators would look favorably upon it. He said they're in constant discussions with regulators, including the Fed, and that they expect this deal to go through by the fourth quarter of this year.
I think it's the Fed that reviews it, too, I think, is the way it works. Okay, thank you so much to Kaylee Lyons for that report on E-Trade and Morgan Stanley. Up next, coronavirus fallout in China. We talk with Anna Ashton of the U.S.-China Business Council about how her members are dealing with a difficult and fluid, to say it lightly, fluid situation over in China. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, the White House is admitting that President Trump's trade stance did hurt economic growth. The president's chief economist told reporters that uncertainty caused by trade negotiations dampened business investment. That contrasts with the president's repeated assertions. He said tariff tactics hadn't hurt the economy. The Supreme Court will gather tomorrow for the first time in nearly a month. The justices will wrap up opinions in cases that were argued in the fall and decide what new cases to take. Most prominent among the possibilities is the latest dispute over the Obama-era health care overhaul. Other cases before the court deal with President Trump's tax records, abortion, immigration, and gun laws. Japan has confirmed that 2 passengers from that quarantine cruise ship have died from the coronavirus. The victims were described as Japanese citizens in their 80s, and South Korea has reported its first fatality. China reports that the death toll from the virus is now more than 2,100. The total number of confirmed cases of the disease is approaching 75,000. Turkey says it's not happy with the progress of talks with Russia on restoring calm in northwestern Syria. The Syrian government forces have been conducting a military campaign to recapture parts of the last rebel-held areas. The violence has driven nearly 1 million people from their homes in recent weeks. and it has strained relations between Russia and Turkey, which support opposing sides in the Syrian conflict. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. The coronavirus epidemic in China is first and foremost a human tragedy, but one with potentially far-reaching business consequences as well. We welcome now Anna Ashton, Director of Business Advisory Services at the United States-China Business Council. She comes to us today from Washington. So welcome, Anna. Good to have you here. Give us a sense of what you're hearing from your members of the council about how they're faring over in China.
Sure. I guess I would start by reiterating what you just said, that this is first and foremost a human crisis. And our members' initial reaction to all of this was to try to seek out ways to be of assistance and to help with relief efforts. And they've continued to do that in a variety of ways, whether it was restarting manufacturing early for companies that made, critical medical equipment, or donating to Red Cross efforts, or, getting masks over to China from countries where there actually was availability, because there aren't a lot of places where you can get them right now, actually. In terms of the business impact, certainly it's undeniable that there is one. It's hard to say exactly how big that business impact will be, because we don't know yet how much longer this is going to continue, if we've gotten to the peak or if we've not gotten to the peak of the outbreak. But certainly, supply chains have been affected, more so for those who are just in time in their supply chain model than for others who have warehouses that have, inventory. But supply chains have been affected. The ability to get employees to work is still a bit of a challenge, but people are trying to get back to work. They are working with local authorities on balancing between public health priorities and public welfare priorities involved in being able to go to work and make a living. And slowly but surely, I think we're getting there.
Okay, Anna, we want to come back to China in just a moment. I'm going to interrupt us just for a moment because Roger Stone, the former confidant of President Trump, is now being sentenced in a court. And the judge has handed out a sentence, at least in the first count, and it's 40 months, a little more than 3 years in prison. You remember, this is a situation where prosecutors recommended 7 to 9 years as much as, and then the Attorney General overruled that, said it was way too much. But at least on the first count, the sentence has come in for Roger Stone, and it's about 40 months, just a little over 3 years. So, Anna Ashton, let's come back to you now on the China issue. One of the questions I want to ask is, how do your members get numbers they can rely upon? Because one of the things we have, certainly back here in New York, is a lot of different numbers floating around. I think we're on the third different revision of the method by which China keeps track of this. How do businesses doing business in China get a sense of what really the numbers are?
I think, they can't do more than rely on the official accounts from the Chinese government, the official accounts from, provincial and local governments, and the official accounts from the World Health Organization and other authorities. They're not, in the business of making these assessments themselves, and they have really little choice other than to put their faith in the authorities who are handling it. I think for the most part, though, their faith is well placed. I think that there is a lot of reason to believe that what the Chinese government is trying to do is make sure that the outbreak doesn't get worse, and also make sure that the economy isn't hit too hard. And from what we're hearing about on-the-ground accounts of the experience of trying to get employees back to work, there's an awful lot of careful thought going into it.
A lot of careful thought going into it, but it must be awfully difficult for the Chinese government to be giving much careful thought to the Phase 1 U.S.-China trade deal. I mean, after all, it just got signed, and this was the time it was going to be implemented. Is that just being held in abeyance? Is that just going to be held on hold until we can get past this epidemic?
So it's early to tell, but here's what I think about that. Larry Kudlow, White House economic advisor, as well as Robert O'Brien, who's a national security advisor at the White House, both said within the last week that they would not be surprised if purchase commitments for 2020 got off to a slower start. And then we heard more recently from China's Ministry of Agriculture that very same sort of message. I don't think we're yet at the point where we can say with any certainty that China will fail to meet its purchase commitments this year or overall over the next 2 years. But I think it's reasonable to believe that there will be a little bit of a slow start in trying to meet its 2020 purchase commitments. And hopefully, if the virus outbreak does not continue for a very long period, then they will be able to catch up at the end of the year. But at the end of the day, people before purchases, right?
Exactly right. And it wouldn't be surprising if the Trump administration said, OK, we'll give you a break here. You've got a really big problem. On the other hand, the Trump administration does not seem to be willing to give China a break at all on Huawei. We just had that Munich security conference going on, and the reports were, at least, that we very explicitly said, European companies, if you keep doing business with Huawei, we will cut off European allies from intelligence gathering that the United States does. How big a problem is that in U.S.-China relations?
It is a problem. It's an ongoing problem. I expect that it's here to stay because it's not just the administration. There is bipartisan concern over Huawei, over the technology competition between the United States and China, where it's headed, and what the strategic objectives are. I think there's a lot of distrust right now between our two countries for a variety of well-founded reasons, including the last 2 years of tariff escalation. What's interesting about the administration's statements about Huawei is that they're not always consistent. We certainly have some hardliners within the administration who are very adamant about not wanting Huawei to be part of anybody's 5G network because of concerns that there could be compromisable equipment. But then again, we have the president tweeting this weekend statements suggesting that he's not in support of stricter controls on sales to Huawei that are currently under consideration by Commerce, State, and Treasury. And we have him saying, he doesn't want to limit Americans' ability to do business with China or to sell things to China or anyone else. And he thinks that some of these proposals to do with export controls and Chinese tech companies coming out of Congress are ridiculous. So who knows exactly where we're headed? But it's not the first time we've seen that sort of discord in the statements between different officials.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Okay, Anna, thank you so much for being with us. That's Anna Ashton of the United States-China Business Council in Washington. I want to recap that breaking news now. Former Trump associate Roger Stone has been sentenced to more than 3 years in prison for lying to Congress and witness tampering. The judge says that there will be probation after that 3+ year sentence, also a $20,000 fine. She says that he has a right to appeal. She'll give him extra time to do that. As we know, there's a motion pending for a new trial as well because of allegations of some impropriety involving the jury foreperson. Coming up here, he's won his share of elections, and he's overseen a presidential race as the head of the Democratic National Committee. We talk with former Pennsylvania Governor Ed Rendell about the debate, the primaries, and the state of his party leading to Milwaukee in July. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Whatever you thought about that Democratic debate in Las Vegas last night, it sure was entertaining and more lively than the other 8 debates that they've had that have led up to it. To get a professional's take on the debate and also on what comes next, we welcome now Ed Rendell. He is former mayor of Philadelphia, former governor of Pennsylvania, and former head of the Democratic National Committee. He's coming to us from Philadelphia, of course. So, Mr. Governor, thank you so much for being with us. What was your take on the debate? We've talked already about the fact that Mike Bloomberg was certainly in the crosshairs for a good part of it.
Well, let me start out by saying, as a loyal Democrat, entertaining is not what we're striving for.
That's well put. Well put.
I was disappointed by the debate in general. 90% of the fire, the incoming tough questions asked by the candidates, were directed at the policies or the personal life of other Democratic candidates who are on the stage. Only 10% of the criticism was aimed at Donald Trump. We're not going to win if we just have a circular firing squad. We've got to try to point out our differences in a civil way and at the same time focus attention on not only Donald Trump the person, but Donald Trump, what he's doing to the values of this country, Donald Trump, what his policies are doing to this country. And we didn't do a very good job of that. In fairness, the moderators in the first hour asked all gotcha questions. They didn't ask any policy questions. So I think we've got to look at this debate format for presidential elections next year and see if we can reform it and make it I think the town meetings are so much better because candidates don't have to give 45-second answers. They can answer questions in depth. They can show their knowledge. They interact with people. I think it's a much better format for learning. Does the candidate know his stuff or her stuff? Are they good candidates? Can they express themselves? Can they lead? I was disappointed in the debate in general. But the takeaways are the mayor did not do very well. He hasn't debated for 11 years. He was out of practice. I don't think he was prepared that well. He certainly didn't have answers for some obvious questions, like the non-disclosure agreement question. I was surprised at that because the mayor is meticulous. He's always prepared. He always knows the hills and valleys that he's going to face. Now, the good news for the mayor, even though it was a subpar performance, is there's another debate in 6 days.
That's right. That's right.
And remember, he's not on the ballot in Nevada. The most jarring impact of his poor performance would have been if he was on the ballot in Nevada. He isn't. Before he's on the ballot, there are at least 2 more debates. So he's going to have a chance to recover.
Yeah.
But it certainly wasn't the start he wanted. Bernie Sanders can thank the mayor because the mayor took all the fire. Normally, the front runner who's leading in the polls in Nevada would have been the recipient of most of the fire.
And I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, it bears repeating that Michael Bloomberg is the founder and majority owner of our company. I think most people know that, but we keep saying that to keep it in people's minds. But one of the things that struck me is there is a front runner, and actually is not Michael Bloomberg, it's Bernie Sanders. And yet there were a couple of sort of jabs at him, but really he was not subject to withering fire last night. Why is that? I thought typically in these debates you went after the front runner.
Well, it's because candidates are still looking at this, that there are lanes in the Democratic Party. There's the progressive lane, and it's Bernie and Elizabeth Warren. And then there's a moderate lane with Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg, Vice President Biden, and, of course, now Mayor Bloomberg. So the moderates wanted to hit Mayor Bloomberg to stop his advance in the polls in all the different states and the national polls. And the mayor's strategy is to become the leading moderate and to get Bernie Sanders one-on-one. Now, the only discordant note from the Sanders point of view is Elizabeth did very well. She was very strong, very energized, and if she takes votes, it may be from people who are tending to think they were going to vote for Bernie Sanders. So that may be the only discordant note, but Bernie Sanders is in a very strong position, in part because of Democratic rules. Delegates are awarded by congressional district. And unless you get 15% of the vote or more in a congressional district, you don't get any delegates.
Right.
So there was a poll in California released yesterday with Bernie at 32, Joe Biden at 15, Mayor Bloomberg at 14, and the other candidates at 11 and 12. If that would happen in a congressional district, and if Joe Biden slipped a half a point, Bernie would get all the delegates in that congressional district because he'd be the only one over 15%. California has 415 delegates. Yeah. If that scenario follows, Bernie could build up a lead in California alone of 200, 250 delegates.
And that's California, but bring it back to Pennsylvania for a moment, a state that you know terribly well. Could Bernie Sanders win Pennsylvania?
If the election were held today, no. He's against fracking, and fracking is viewed in Pennsylvania as an economic boom for the state. Natural gas is, I think, a very good bridge to the day when we can produce our electricity by renewables. That day is a long way off. In Pennsylvania, renewables only account for 7% of our electricity. Natural gas, as you know, produces 50% less carbon than coal burning for electricity. So he's got that against him. The health care plan and the totality of costs of all of the things that he's advocating will make it very hard for him to carry Pennsylvania. But there's a caveat. Donald Trump can lose Pennsylvania. If it was Trump versus Sanders, I don't think Bernie could win it, but Donald Trump could lose it. I mean, consider this. Donald Trump's acquitted of the impeachment. He makes a fairly good State of the Union speech. The best thing for him to do was to act presidential for the next 7 months and ride a wave of victory into November. But he immediately goes out and starts firing innocent people who did nothing but do their duty and respond to subpoenas. He goes and pardons rich, connected people, doesn't pardon any poor people. He pardons people that the public thinks are outrageous. He says Rod Blagojevich was the sentence was too severe. Rod Blagojevich sold the Senate seat. So Donald Trump is very capable of losing the election. Can Bernie Sanders win it? Maybe.
At the same time, you look nationally, President Trump at this point, his approval rating is up to 49%. I think it's a high point since he's been president. People kept saying, well, he can't win with low approval. And the disapprove is 50, so just barely eclipses it. So at this point, isn't Donald Trump a pretty formidable candidate for any of those 6 on that stage last night?
Yeah, he is. Now, again, the other side of that argument is any one of those 6 in national polls head-to-head with Donald Trump beats him. But they beat him by 8 points, 9 points, 4 points, 3 points, and that can change during the campaign. Look, give Donald Trump his due. In my judgment, he's a disastrous president, but he's a very good campaigner because he knows how to deflect attention onto his opponent. If Donald Trump had to run yes or no to continue as president, I think he'd lose 55-45, regardless of what those approval ratings are. But if he's got an opponent, he's very good at making the opponent the issue. And if he can do that, he'll win. But Donald Trump is a loose cannon. No one can predict how he's going to act. Give Bernie Sanders some credit for being absolutely a true believer in what he says. He believes what he says, and he's going to campaign that way all the way to the end. And I think his authenticity will gain him some approval. But he's going to be a big target. Donald Trump started using the socialist label in this year's State of the Union address, and he's going to talk about socialism, socialism, socialism. It's all you're going to hear if Bernie's the candidate.
Okay, Governor, really great to have you on with us, as it always is. That is former Pennsylvania Governor Ed Rendell, coming from Philadelphia. Coming up here, former Trump associate Roger Stone is sentenced to more than 3 years in prison. The latest ahead. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Former Trump associate Roger Stone has been sentenced to more than 3 years in prison. He has also received a period of probation after that prison term. Stone was convicted of lying to Congress and witness tampering. We welcome now Bloomberg News legal executive editor Tina Davis. So welcome, Tina. Good to have you.
Thanks.
The judge sentenced, and it's interesting, in the light of what the original recommendation was, she didn't go with the harsher recommendation that was originally proposed by the prosecution.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably the most interesting sentencing hearing we'll have all year, maybe for a few years. But yes, as you recall, so last week the federal prosecutors came in and recommended 7 to 9 years, which would have, if the judge had taken them up on that, would have made him the longest serving or had the longest sentence of anyone out of the Mueller probe. The judge, and then we had the presidential tweet that came after that, and then the revised sentence guidelines of 3 to 4 years. The judge is actually, her range falls within that. But what she did do is she took the government to task a great deal over the back and forth over what the actual sentencing recommendation was going to be. And in fact, she also took Mr. Stone to task a lot and said basically he's not being punished for standing up for the president. He's being punished for covering up for the president.
Well, and there was also some misconduct from Mr. Stone after he was indicted, including a social media post with a picture of the judge, as I recall, with a target over the side of it. And a lot of things going on. The judge was none too pleased, Mr. Stone.
Yeah, I mean, this is a judge that it takes a while for her to react, and that was sort of the last straw that broke the camel's back in that case, and we did see her lash out at him for that. She mentioned again today that she felt like his behavior was atrocious, and that, again, that this was not a political cover-up, but that he was being charged because of what he'd said to Congress and because of the witness tampering that had gone on.
But this is not the end of it. I mean, Mr. Stone has a motion, I think, in front of this judge for a new trial because of possible misconduct by the jury, and then there's an appeal. The judge said you got a right to appeal, so you can take it up top if you want. Right,
and she actually took the decision to not put him in handcuffs today and have him start to begin his term right away because, as you mentioned, there is a motion already before her for retrial because of what a foreperson has done on the jury. And we also expect that there will be an appeal of this sentence. There is also the opportunity for the president to weigh in. He's been tweeting overnight what others have been saying, that he should step in with a pardon. And obviously from this week, we know that he's somewhat prone to pardons right now, so we might expect action there as well.
Yeah, he knows how to do it, that's for sure. He's figured out how to pardon people. But as I understand with the president, he didn't say yes, he didn't say no. He was sort of coy about the question.
Right. What he did is he tweeted out a link to a Tucker Carlson bit on Fox News that says, really, it's up to the president now to pardon him. And we actually had protesters at the courthouse with a petition asking, and they said they have something like 160,000 signatures seeking a presidential pardon. Again, I don't know if the signatures necessarily do anything here, because we've already had a president hint a couple of times that this was an unfair, this was a miscarriage of justice, and so he may actually step in.
Yeah, he seems like he's inclined in that direction, if you can judge by his tweets. Okay, thanks so much to Tina Davis. She's our new Bloomberg legal executive editor. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk with Max Baucus, former U.S. ambassador to China, also former U.S. senator for about 36 years, as I recall. We're going to talk with him about the coronavirus and what is going on over in China, as well as talking about the state of the Democratic Party after that big debate last night. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.